The first type of classification is two kingdom classification, and followed by three kingdom classification, and followed by four kingdom classification, and followed by five kingdom classification. Of these classifications, the most important accepted classification throughout the universe, five kingdom classification. The five kingdom classification was proposed by Robert H. Whittaker. He was American taxonomist. According to the five kingdom classification, the first kingdom is Monera, followed by Protista, followed by fungi, followed by plantae, followed by animalia. Now, in the kingdom Monera, all are unicellular and prokaryotes. From kingdom Protista onwards, all are eukaryotes. In the kingdom Protista, all are unicellular eukaryotes, whereas in the kingdom fungi, plantae and animalia, all are multicellular eukaryotes. In the kingdom fungi, all are multicellular decomposers, whereas kingdom plantae, all are multicellular autotrophs, whereas in the kingdom animalia, multicellular heterotrophs are present. Now, after this, what is the next part? That is contributions. That is contributions. Now, under this, we have to discuss the Buffon concerned with the natural history, Cuvier concerned with the comparative anatomy, whereas Bernard concerned with the homeostasis, Charles Darwin concerned with the natural selection theory, whereas Gregor Johann Mendel concerned with inheritance. Again it is repeated. What are the contributions of the scientist? Buffon associated with natural history, Cuvier comparative anatomy, Bernard homeostasis, Charles Darwin natural selection theory, and next Gregor Johann Mendel the inheritance of characters from one generation to another generation. Now we have to discuss the zoology meaning. Now we discuss the meaning of zoology. Under this, the first one is the biology. The first one is biology. The word biology proposed by J.B. Lamarck. In the same way, the word annelida also proposed by J.B. Lamarck. What is meant by biology? It is the study of living organisms. What are the living organisms? Plants, animals and microbes. The biology has one branch, we call it as botany. What is meant by botany? The study of plants. The second one we call it as zoology. What is meant by zoology? The study of animals. In association with plants and animals, what are the other living organisms? The microbes. What is the meaning of microbiology? The study of microbes, we call it as microbiology. Now we have to discuss what are the branches present in the zoology. What are the branches present in the zoology? In the zoology, the first branch we call it as the taxonomy. What is meant by taxonomy? It is the study of identification, classification and nomenclature. It is followed by morphology. What is meant by morphology? The study of structure, form, shape, size, color, etc. called the morphology. The morphology is broadly classified into external morphology, internal morphology. What is meant by external morphology? The study of external characters. What about the internal morphology? It is the study of internal characters. Again, the internal morphology is classified into two categories. One we call it as anatomy and the second one we call it as histology. Now what is meant by anatomy? The study of arrangement of internal organs or organ systems, that we call it as anatomy. What is meant by histology? It is the study of various tissues. What is the other name of histology? It is also called the microanatomy. The histology, it is followed by the next branch, we call it as cytology. What is meant by cytology? It is the study of structure, function of cell and its organelle, that we call it as cytology. It is followed by the cell biology. What is meant by cell biology? Cell biology explains the cell is the structural functional unit. Now, the cell biology is followed by the physiology. What is the next branch? The physiology. What is meant by physiology? It is the study of functions or processes of different organs that we call it as physiology. It is followed by the embryology. What is meant by embryology? It is the study of fertilization, cleavage, growth and differentiation, that we call it as embryology. What is the other name of embryology? The developmental biology. It is followed by evolution. What is meant by evolution? The meaning of evolution is unfolding. What is meant by evolution? It explains the origin of life and genetic adaptations of organisms. The word evolution is proposed by Herbert Spencer. Now it is followed by paleontology. It is followed by paleontology. What is meant by paleontology? The study of fossils. The paleontology is classified into paleobotany. What is meant by paleobotany? The study of plant fossils. What is meant by paleozoology? The study of animal fossils, that we call it as paleozoology. Now it is followed by the genetics. Now what is meant by genetics? The inheritance of characters from one generation to another generation. It means the genetics explains not only inheritance but also variations. What is the meaning of variations? The changes. The word genetics was proposed by the Bateson. Now the genetics is followed by ecology. What is meant by ecology? It is the study of relations between the living organisms and surrounding environment, that we call it as ecology. What is the other name of ecology? Environmental biology. The word ecology is proposed by Ernest Haeckel. Now these are the important branches associated with the zoology. Now we have to discuss what are the relations. What are the relations between zoology and other sciences? Under this category, what are the important ones? The chemistry related to biology, we call it as biochemistry. Now, what is meant by biochemistry? The biochemistry explains the osmosis, the diffusion and membrane transport. Now, what is meant by biophysics? What is meant by biophysics? The application of physical principles, that we call it as biophysics. Now, what is meant by biometry? What is meant by biometry? Application of mathematics, that we call it as biometry. What is meant by biostatistics? The application of statistics, that we call it as biostatistics. Now, here the important one is geology. What is the significance of geology? The geology helps to understand the formation of fossils, whereas paleontology is the study of fossils. The next one is geography. The next one is geography. What is the significance of geography? It helps to study the geography. What is meant by geography? The study of distribution of animals. Now the next one we call it as eugenics. What is meant by eugenics? The applications of genetics for the development of mankind or improvement of mankind, that we call it as eugenics. Now it is followed by euphenics. It is followed by euphenics. What is meant by euphenics? It is the study of phenotypic improvement of human beings after birth, that we call it as euphenics. Now the next one we call it as bioenergetics. What is meant by bioenergetics? It explains the formation of energy, the usage of energy and transformation of energy from one cell to another cell and utilization of energy by the cells of the living organism. Now the next one we call it as the biotechnology. What is meant by biotechnology? It is the use of microorganisms or the cellular components in a proper way, that we call it as biotechnology. What is the significance of biotechnology? The biotechnology helps to control the pollution. It helps to produce the transgenic plants and animals. In the biotechnology, one part we call it as the genetic engineering. What is meant by genetic engineering? The manipulation of genes, that we call it as genetic engineering. Now, it is followed by the basic principles of classification. The basic principles of classification. Under this category, we have to discuss what is the first one. We call it as the taxonomy. What is meant by taxonomy? Already we learned. It explains the identification, nomenclature and classification. The word taxonomy proposed by A.P.D. Candoli. Now in the taxonomy, one part we call it as classification. What is the basic unit of classification? The species. Name the person stated that species is the basic unit of classification, Carolus Linnaeus. Now, the next one is systematics. Systematics. It is very, very important under Eamcet point of view. What is meant by systematics? The systematics explains the diversity of an organisms. The systematics explains the diversity and evolutionary trends of organisms. Now, very important bit regarding the Eamcet. What is the key part of systematics? That we call it as the taxonomy. Now, under the basic principles of classification, one more important one is, now this is the name of one genus. If we add idea to the name of the genus, we are getting the superfamily. If we add the suffix ide to the name of the genus, we are getting the family. If we add the suffix ine to the name of the genus, we are getting the subfamily. Now, as we observe one example, the scientific name of man, we call it as Homo sapiens. The man belongs to the superfamily Hominoidea and family Hominidae, and subfamily is Homininae. Now, under the basic principles of the classification, the next one we call it as the nomenclature. The next one we call it as the nomenclature. Now, what is meant by nomenclature? The naming of organism. What type of name is given? The giving scientific names, that we call it as a nomenclature. The nomenclature is broadly classified into, one we call it as binomial nomenclature, and the second one we call it as trinomial nomenclature, and the third one we call it as tautonymy. Now, what is the question under the Eamcet? Binomial nomenclature. Under binomial nomenclature, only two Latin words are present. Hence, it is called the binomial. In the binomial nomenclature, one we call it as the genus, and the second one we call it as the species. The extension of binomial nomenclature, that we call it as the trinomial nomenclature. In the trinomial nomenclature, three Latin words are present: genus, species, and subspecies. Now, as we observe the binomial nomenclature, under binomial nomenclature, one word is genus, and the second word we call it as the species. Now, if a genus or species is given different names by different authors, the earlier name is valid. That we call it as the law of priority. Now we are getting a doubt. What about the other names? The other names are considered as the junior synonym. The later uses of that name refer to different organisms, that we call it as the junior homonym. Again, it is repeated. In the binomial nomenclature, one is genus and the second one we call it as the species. Now, if a genus or species is given different names by different persons, the earliest valid name, that we call it as the law of priority. What about the other names for that organism? The other names for that organism are considered as the junior synonym. The latter uses name refer to different organisms, that we call it as junior homonym. Now, as we observe the nomenclature, the rules of nomenclature given by ICZ. What is meant by ICZ? International Congress of Zoology. How the rules are considered? The rules are considered as ICZN. What is meant by ICZN? International Code of the Zoological Nomenclature. And now, The binomial nomenclature is followed by trinomial nomenclature. What is meant by trinomial nomenclature? It is the extension of binomial nomenclature. Here 3 Latin words are present: genus, species and subspecies. The species and subspecies name should be started with a small letter. Now what are the examples for the trinomial nomenclature? We know very well. Homo sapiens sapiens. What are the other examples? Pediculus, humanus, humanus. Pediculus, humanus, capitis. All these examples come under the phylum Arthropoda with reference to the harmful insects. Now it is followed by tautonym. What is meant by tautonym? In the tautonym, the genus and species names are one and the same, or the genus name repeats as a species name. Here one example is deer, axis, axis, rat, ratus, ratus, cobra, naja, naja, gallus, gallus, katla, katla, chanos, chanos. All these are the examples come under the tautonym. Now we have to discuss the biological classification. The biological classification. It is very, very important. The biological classification. Now under the biological classification, we have to discuss the first of all the history of biological classification. What is meant by history of biological classification? Now according to the Vedic literature, how the organisms are classified: 740 plants plus 240 animals. That is the classification given by the Vedic literature. And Chandogya Upanishad. The Upanishads classified the living organisms into only the animals. Now it is followed by Hippocrates, Aristotle and other Greek philosophers. How they classified the organisms? They classified the organisms into insects, birds, fishes and next whales. Such type of classification is given by Hippocrates, Aristotle and other Greek philosophers. Now we go for the John Ray. What is the significance of this person? John Ray, he introduced the word species. The species word proposed by John Ray. The differences between the genus and species also explained by John Ray. He wrote a book called Historia Generalis Plantarum. In the Historia Generalis Plantarum, he classified more than 18,000 plants and animals. Now, one more important person is the Carolus Linnaeus. What is the importance of Carolus Linnaeus? He was considered as the father of taxonomy, and he was the person popularized binomial nomenclature in the 10th edition of Systema Naturae. What are the books written by Carolus Linnaeus? Systema Naturae and Species Plantarum. In the Species Plantarum, he classified how many plants? 4,000 plants were classified by Carolus Linnaeus. And this is the history of biological classification. Now, under biological classification, we have to discuss the systems. We have to discuss the systems. What is meant by systems? The biological classification is broadly classified into one we call it as artificial and the second one we call it as natural. The artificial classification was followed by Aristotle and Linnaeus. Now it is very important one is as we observe the Linnaeus artificial classification is based on the mutual relatedness. Now once again it is repeated. The artificial classification followed by Aristotle and Linnaeus. The Linnaeus artificial classification based on mutual relatedness. Now the second one we call it as the natural classification. Now what is meant by natural classification? It is based on the natural relations. It is based on the natural relations. Here it is very, very important for the Eamcet point of view. The natural classification is classified into phenotypic classification or numerical classification. And the second one we call it as cladistic classification or phylogenetic classification. Now, in the phenotypic classification, we have to use OTU. What is meant by OTU? Operational taxonomic units are used in the phenotypic classification or numerical classification. Here, we should not consider the ancestry of organisms. Now, What is meant by cladistic classification or phylogenetic classification? Here we have to consider the phylogeny of organism. We have to consider the ancestor of organism. And under cladistic classification, we have to explain the analogous characters as well as the homologous characters. Now, here one more important bit is, in order to explain the phylogeny of one organism, as we observe the Haeckel, he introduced the branching. As well as trees. Once again it is repeated. In order to represent the phylogeny of one organism, Mr. Haeckel used the branching and trees to explain the phylogeny of one organism. And already we are having one idea. Mr. Haeckel proposed the word ecology. The ecology is also called the environmental biology. Now it is the biological classification. This biological classification is followed by hierarchy. What is meant by hierarchy or the systematic hierarchy? In the hierarchy, we have to use different categories. One example we call it as a kingdom. It is followed by phylum, followed by class, followed by order, followed by family, followed by genus, and followed by species. And these are important categories in order to classify the kingdom Animalia as well as the kingdom Plantae. The first one is kingdom, followed by phylum, followed by class, followed by order, followed by family, followed by genus, and followed by species. Now, in these categories, what is the biggest one? The kingdom. What is the smallest one? Species. What is the smallest one? Species. What is the basic unit? Species. What is the fundamental unit? Species. Now, the kingdom, the class, the order, the genus, the species. All these categories are proposed by Linnaeus. Whereas, as we observe the phylum, this category was proposed by Haeckel. Now, as we observe regarding the Haeckel, he not only coined the word ecology, he also used the branching trees to explain the phylogeny. At the same time, the phylum was also proposed by Haeckel. Now, as we observe the biggest taxon, kingdom, the kingdom included different phyla. The phylum included different classes. The class included different orders. The order included different families. And one family included different genera. One genus included the species. Now, as we observe the species, it has the subspecies. Now, as we observe the subspecies, it is geographically isolated. The subspecies present in different geographical areas. As we observe the subspecies, they are having the phenotypic relations. Now, as we observe the subspecies, what are the examples for the subspecies? One example is Corvus splendens splendens. It is the crow confined to what type of geographical areas? India and Pakistan. Corvus splendens insolens. It is the crow confined to the Myanmar. What is the third one? The Corvus splendens protegatus, that is confined to the Sri Lanka. Now, regarding the hierarchy, we have to observe the taxonomic position of man. What is the taxonomic position of man? Now, as we observe the taxonomic position of man, the man come under the kingdom Animalia, sub-kingdom Eumetazoa, and come under grade Bilateria or Triploblastica, and come under the division Deuterostomia, and come under the subdivision Enterocoelomata, and phylum Chordata, subphylum Vertebrata, and superclass Gnathostomata, and class Mammals, subclass Theria, and infraclass Eutheria, and order Primates, suborder Anthropoidea, superfamily Hominoidea, family Hominidae, and subfamily Homininae, and the genus Homo, and the species is Sapiens. Now, as we observe the taxonomic position of man, in the taxonomic position of man, what are the main taxons? One we call it as kingdom, followed by phylum, followed by class, followed by order, followed by family, followed by genus, followed by species. And the remaining positions are considered as the intermediary positions. Now, after discussing the taxonomic position of the man, we have to discuss the species concept. It is very, very important under the Eamcet point of view. Now, under this category species concept, the first one is the word species. In the Latin language, what is the meaning of the species? Kind or appearance. The species word was proposed by John Ray. John Ray explained the differences between the genus and species. He wrote a book called Historia Generalis Plantarum. In the Historia Generalis Plantarum, he classified more than 18,000 plants and animals. And now, according to the John Ray, what is meant by species? It is the group of organisms having morphological similarities. Now it is followed by Linnaeus. Now we are having a good idea regarding the Linnaeus. He was considered as the father of taxonomy, and he popularized the binomial nomenclature in the 10th edition of Systema Naturae. According to Linnaeus, what is the unit of taxonomy, or what is the unit of classification? The species. Now we have to discuss different persons, how they gave different definitions regarding the species. One we call it as Emerson, and the second one we call it as Lindsay, and the third one we call it as Mayer. And now, according to the Emerson, what is meant by species? Genetically distinctive, reproductively isolated natural population. That is called species in the words of Emerson. What is meant by, according to the Lindsay, what is meant by species? Aggregation of individuals. They resemble with each other and derived from the common reproductive sequence. That is the species in the words of Lindsay. And what about the Mayer? In the words of Mayer, what is meant by species? Potentially interbreeding, reproductively isolated with other species. Again, it is repeated. According to the Emerson, what is meant by species? Genetically distinctive, reproductively isolated natural population. In the words of Lindsay, what is meant by species? Aggregation of individuals resemble with each other but derived from a common reproductive sequence. In the words of Mayer, what is meant by species? Potentially interbreeding, reproductively isolated with other species. Now, the next one we call it as Dobzhansky. According to the Dobzhansky, what is meant by species? Mendelian population. What is meant by Mendelian population? A group of individuals living in a particular area at a particular time, sharing common gene pool, can interbreed and produce fertile offsprings. That we call it as Mendelian population. For our kind information, once again it is repeated. Who called species as Mendelian population? Dobzhansky. In the words of Dobzhansky, what is meant by Mendelian population? The group of individuals living in a particular area at a particular time, sharing common gene pool, can interbreed among themselves and always produce the fertile offspring. That we call it as Mendelian population in the words of Dobzhansky. But as we observe the species, this is one species. It is crossed with another species. One species do not cross with another species. If one species crossed with another species, what type of organisms we are getting? The sterile organisms. Here one example is the horse is crossed with donkey. We are having a good idea. The horse, this is one species. Yes, this is another species. If two different species are crossed, we are getting what type of offspring? Sterile offspring. Here one example we call it as the mule, and the second example we call it as inne. This is the species concept. Now we have to explain what type of bufflons present in the kingdom Animalia. Bufflons. Now the bufflons are again repeated while we are discussing different phyla. In the kingdom Animalia, what type of bufflons are present? The first one we call it as primary germ layers. Now what are the primary germ layers? Ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm. If only two germ layers are present, that we call it as diploblastica. What is the best example for the diploblastica? The phylum Cnidaria. If three germ layers are present, it is called triploblastica. What are the examples for the triploblastica? From platyhelminthes to mammals. Now, what is the next bufflon? The body organization. Here, the body organization is classified into in the kingdom Animalia. We are discussing the body organization in the kingdom Animalia. The first one is the cellular grade, second one tissue grade, the third one is organ system grade. What is meant by cellular grade of organization? The functions are performed by cells. What is the example for the cellular grade of organization? The best example is phylum Porifera. What is meant by tissue organization? The functions are performed by different tissues. What is the best example? The phylum Cnidaria. What about the organ system organization? The functions are performed by different organs or organ systems, that we call it as organ system organization. What are the examples for this organization? Platyhelminthes to mammals. Now, what is the next bufflon? That we call it as the body cavity. What is meant by body cavity? It is nothing but the coelom. Now, the body cavity is classified into acoelomata, pseudocoelomata and eucoelomata. Now, what is meant by acoelomata? Between body wall and alimentary canal, there is no space. It is completely solid. That we call it as acoelomata. What is the example for the acoelomata? Phylum Platyhelminthes. What is meant by pseudocoelomata? Here, body cavity present, but it is not true. Why it is not that true? Because it is not covered and protected by mesodermal epithelia. What is the best example for the pseudocoelomata? The nematoda. What is meant by eucoelom? Here, the body cavity is true. What is meant by true body cavity? Externally, internally covered and protected by mesodermal epithelia. What are the examples for the eucoelomata? From annelida to mammals. Now, what is the next bufflon? That we call it as symmetry. Now, what is meant by symmetry? The arrangement of body parts in a geometrical design, that we call it as symmetry. Now, different symmetries are present, but here we have to discuss initially two types of symmetries. One we call it as bilateral symmetry, the second one we call it as radial symmetry. What is meant by bilateral symmetry? In the bilateral symmetry, through one division plane we are getting the antimeres. What is the example for the bilateral symmetry? From platyhelminthes to mammals. Here, one or two exceptions are the present, but they are not discussed right now. Now, what is meant by radial symmetry? In the radial symmetry, we are getting the antimeres with the help of or through many division planes, that we call it as radial symmetry. What is the best example for the radial symmetry? That we call it as Cnidaria. Now, we go for the fate of blastopore. Now, here the student get one doubt. What is meant by blastopore? It is the embryonic pore. Now, based on the blastopore, how the organisms are classified? Protostomes and deuterostomes. What is meant by protostomia? In these animals, the blastopore becomes the mouth. What are the examples for the protostomia? Platyhelminthes to mollusca. What is meant by deuterostomia? The blastopore becomes anus. What are the example? Echinodermata, hemichordata and chordata. Now, what is the next bufflon? That we call it as gut. Here, what is the meaning of the gut? Nothing but the alimentary canal or the primitive gut. As we observe the gut, it is again two kinds. One we call it as incomplete. It is also called the sac-like. The second one we call it as complete. What is meant by incomplete alimentary canal? The alimentary canal has only one opening, that we call it as mouth. Here, the mouth itself acts as the anus. Now, what is meant by complete alimentary canal? The alimentary canal has the mouth and anus. Such complete alimentary canal where we are going to observe. The complete alimentary canal is going to observe in the few examples of Turbellaria, and from nematoda onwards we have to observe a complete alimentary canal. What is the last bufflon? That we call it as circulation. Now, here the circulation is classified into two categories. One we call it as open type of circulation and closed type of circulation. What is meant by open type of circulation? The blood flows in sinuses. Here we are getting one doubt. What is meant by sinuses? Spaces. The blood flows in the spaces, that we call it as open type of circulation. What is meant by closed circulation? The blood flows in definite blood vessels. What is meant by definite blood vessel? This is the blood vessel. It is lined inside by endothelium. If the blood vessel is lined inside by endothelium, that we call it as a definite blood vessel. Now these are the different bufflons are going to observe in the kingdom Animalia. Now lastly, what is the classification of kingdom Animalia? Finally, what is the classification of kingdom Animalia? Now, the kingdom Animalia is classified into two sub-kingdoms. The first one we call it as Parazoa and the second one we call it as Eumetazoa. In the Parazoa, all are primitive multicellular animals. What is the best example for the Parazoa? Phylum Porifera. Now, what about the Eumetazoa? In the Eumetazoans, we have to observe the tissues, organs and organ systems. The Eumetazoa is classified into two grades. One we call it as radiata and the second one we call it as bilateria. Now, what is the other name of radiata? Diploblastica. Two germ layers are present. Now, what is the best example for the grade radiata? Phylum Nidaria. In the Eumetazoa, what is the first phylum? The Nidaria. In the kingdom Animalia, what is the first phylum? Porifera. Now, grade bilateria. Here, what type of symmetry generally present? The bilateral symmetry. How many germ layers are present? 3 germ layers, so called the Triploblastica. Now, the grade bilateria. What are the examples for the grade bilateria? Platyhelminthes to mammals. What is the first triploblastic phylum? Platyhelminthes. What is the first bilaterally symmetrical phylum? Platyhelminthes. Mesoderm first developed in Platyhelminthes. Now, the grade bilateria is classified into two divisions. One we call it as protostomia and the second one we call it as deuterostomia. Now, we are having a good idea. What is meant by protostomia? The blastopore becomes mouth. What is meant by deuterostomia? The blastopore becomes anus. Now, this protostomia is classified into how many subdivisions? One we call it as acoelomata, pseudocoelomata and schizocoelomata. What is meant by acoelomata? Coelom absent, one example is Platyhelminthes. What is meant by pseudocoelomata? Here the coelom is not true. It is not covered and protected by mesodermal epithelia. One example is nematoda. What is meant by schizocoelomata? Coelom formed by splitting of mesoderm. Here the example Annelida, Arthropoda, mollusca. What is the first schizocoelomata? Annelida. What is the biggest? Arthropoda. What is the second biggest? Mollusca. Now, in the division deuterostomia, only one subdivision is present, that we call it as enterocoelomata. What is meant by enterocoelomata? The coelom develops as a pouches from the archenteron. Here, what is meant by archenteron? Nothing but the elementary canal or primitive gut. What are the examples for the enterocoelomata? One example is echinodermata. One example is hemichordata. One example is chordata. In the enterocoelomata as well as in the deuterostomia, what is the invertebrate phylum? Echinodermata. What is the biggest phylum? Chordata. Now, this is the first unit, basics. Regarding the EAPCET examination, from the basics we may get 1 mark or may not. In the basics, what is the important part? The bufflons and outline classification of kingdom Animalia and the species concept. In the next class, we have to discuss the general characters and classification of invertebrates. In the main EAPCET examination, from the invertebrate phyla, we are getting how many marks? The 4 marks. Now, what are the important points regarding the basics? Briefly, the word species means kind or appearance. What is the first phylum under the kingdom Animalia? Porifera. What is the first phylum under the subkingdom Eumetazoa? Nidaria. What is the first phylum under the grade bilateria? Platyhelminthes. Mesoderm first developed in Platyhelminthes. And what is the first phylum under the protostomia? Platyhelminthes. What is the first phylum under deuterostomata? Echinodermata. What is the first phylum under enterocoelomata? Echinodermata. in all aspects. As we observe in all aspects in the kingdom Animalia, what is the biggest phylum? Arthropoda. What is the second biggest phylum? The mollusca. Now, as we observe the eucoelomates, what are the examples for the eucoelomates? Annelida, Arthropoda, mollusca, echinodermata, hemichordata and chordata. Under eucoelomates, what is the first eucoelomate phylum? Annelida. Now, in the eucoelomates, what is the biggest one? Arthropoda. What is the second biggest one? Mollusca. Now, as we observe the schizocoelomates, here coelom formed by splitting of the mesoderm. In the schizocoelomates, one is Annelida, Arthropoda, mollusca. What is the first schizocoelomate? Annelida. What is the biggest schizocoelomate? Arthropoda. What is the second biggest schizocoelomate? The mollusca. These are the important points with reference to the first unit basics. And one more important is, under the basic principles of classification, what is the key part of systematics? That we call it as taxonomy. One more important point in the basics is the binomial nomenclature popularized by Carolus Linnaeus in the 10th edition of Systema Naturae. What is the unit of binomial nomenclature? The 10th edition of Systema Naturae. Dear students, we are going to meet in the next class with the invertebrata phyla.